Thank you for talking with me today, and I'm just wondering if you could share with me your project that you're currently working on, and your background and your relationship with Indonesia in 1965, and how that relates to your current work.
So my current research is for my PhD is on transitional justice and democratization in Indonesia. Basically, transitional justice is like a lens looking at how state and society come to terms with their past injustice, including past human rights abuses, and how that could make democracy healthier and sustainable in a way. So part of that past injustice in Indonesia history is the 65 mass violence. So taking 65 as one of, if we can say, the most important event in our history that we need to look back on and learn something from that, and that the state and society acknowledge that this thing is wrong and that it cannot happen in the future. So that makes, I believe, our democracy would be more healthier.
And with your current research based at the ANU, it's a topic that in Indonesia still has a very strong resonance, and indeed a great resistance toward re-examining it and delving back, opening old wounds. I mean, how would you pursue, say, the same topic in an Indonesian university, or would that be more difficult, or is it better to be doing it here because it's slightly more open or less controversial at the ANU?
That's, I think, the biggest puzzle, because here we have the past part of our history and the national identity on that massacre, and it's a large massacre, and some people acknowledge that one of the greatest massacre in the 20th century, for example. But yet most Indonesians are ignore it, like in a way that it's just our past and we leave it all behind and we just move on with whatever we have now and tomorrow. But the thing is, we cannot move on until that thing settled first, and we acknowledge that that happened. And because most of Indonesian until today, well, maybe from the 1998, starting from the reform until today, things are much more open for other discourses on that particular events in society, and that the societies now has alternatives to learn their histories. Much more easier to talk about that in today's democracy, but still lots of people, especially institutions or groups that involved directly or indirectly or benefited from whatever happened in that period, are still resisted to any discussions or efforts to attempts to address it or acknowledge it nationally or as part of our history. So I think in a way doing it from other parts of the of the world, not particularly in Indonesia, give benefits not only to reflect what happened and to observe how society is dealing it, because I think that's give me benefit by doing it here at ANU, because when I imagine if I do it in Indonesia, it's kind of difficult for me to really observe what's going on in the society and how I can make some distance on that, because back home in Indonesia I'm also involved in many in some of the activities to address these cases of past injustice for my works in both as academic in University of Indonesia, but also as helping some NGOs and civil society organizations coming to terms with these issues.
Now, you mentioned earlier transitional justice, and I just wondered, are there different forms of transitional justice? And I'm thinking South Africa's coming to mind, where we had the Truth Commission, and we had this this idea under certain circumstances, people weren't going to be sort of prosecuted, and they were going to sort of let the truth come out. What kind of justice or process would you see or benefiting Indonesia in regards to kind of acknowledging these things? What sort of transitional justice would work, do you think, in the Indonesian context?
I think in particular for the 65 case, I think any kinds of justice should work. The problem is there isn't any justice, any kinds of justice for this particular case. Not for the victims, not for the nations, not for the groups in society, and not for the state as well. So both, like in the larger literatures on transitional justice, we know retributive justice and restorative justice, which basically try to differentiate, justice based on formal judiciary process like prosecutions, and justice with non-judicially process that relates more on, like the healing of the victims and the narratives of history, this kind of things. And unfortunately for 65, there hasn't been any of that national state-based attempts to address it, to have it. But there has been lots of initiatives from the society, especially from civil society, NGOs, and victims groups try to do justice, but no positive response from the state to accommodate that. So we thought maybe there should be more and more alternatives to try to push the state to, it's time for us to do justice for the 65.
So in essence, we've had, say, grassroots moments, we've had organizational ones with NGOs, we've had moments where certain politicians have mentioned, I think Wahyu mentioned something about regret. I can't quite think of what he was saying, but he did mention aspects of these things in the sort of post-Suharto era, but not much has shifted.
Yeah, so that's the thing with transitional justice approach, because in general, or most of the literatures is looking at state-based justice. State is try to settle whatever it's past through formal mechanisms, including trials or prosecutions or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you mentioned in South Africa. We've tried that, so it's not totally right to say that there hasn't been anything from state. We did try that. The state did actually came with some of these options on transitional justice. We had trials, the ad hoc human rights trials for the referendum case in Timor-Leste. And we had the also ad hoc trials for 1984 Tanjung Priok massacre. So, and we also had once a bill on Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but all of them were failed, because my indications of failure is, one is that we still cannot challenge impunity, because out of all the trials that we've done for the past human rights cases, we have 100% of acquittals. So no one's actually punished for whatever they did in the past. And another indication is we still until now don't have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because the Constitutional Court annulled the law just a year after it was passed. So, right. And so there is no other windows of opportunity to do those kind of initiative again. So that's why the civil society try to push from below, and this is, I think, what's not really been explored within the literatures or research on transitional justice, how the bottom-up approach for transitional justice has been done in certain countries where state is still being denial of what happened.
Of these things.
Mm.
One thing, if I come back to 65, and you mentioned this idea of impunity, and through the literature, and even in my own sort of research of looking at Australian relations with Indonesia, army responsibility for the massacres is widely understood. It's known that it is the army that is primarily responsible, that it's the authority structure that will be the government in waiting. This is the government that Australia, the United States, United Kingdom, Japan want to deal with. And they are conducting this incredible massacre with attempts to kind of conduct mass killings in secret, all of these things. And yet the narrative that comes across in the history, and you mentioned the history, and even I guess in a political science point of view, the narrative that comes across is almost a kind of anti-communist fairy tale of what they say happened did happen, and in essence the narrative gets shaped to fit what the perpetrators of the crime wanted it to be. In that kind of context, where you have the monument to the generals, you have such a pivotal moment in Indonesian history, perhaps, as you mentioned, the greatest moment in modern Indonesian history. How then does the state come back and find equilibrium from a moment where the state has perhaps been, well, not perhaps been, has been excessive in its actions and hasn't been truthful? When I spoke with Robert Quirby, he talked about this idea that it wasn't hard for Indonesians to be cynical about the idea of being deceived by power. So how hard would it be to correct the narrative historically, and then begin this process of justice?
I think in that particular questions, it'll be then interesting to ask another questions. Is it really there has been a change in Indonesia's structural and power regime in a way? Because I believe a particular state and society who transition from one regime to another regime took place, and one of the indication if the new one can actually acknowledge what happened and then even change the narrative of the history to at least to try to differentiate or make distance itself from the past repressive regime like New Order or Suharto's regime, for example, in Indonesia. But even till today, we don't have such things. So that for me indicates that there hasn't really a change structurally, or maybe in terms of political actors of in Indonesia. So that is one that might explain why is it so hard to address 65 and try to change the narrative of the history. Not necessarily that all these hegemonic discourses with the monument, with the textbook, or with the whatever we have. There has been some changes. There has been some challenge to that, but it really depends on who is in power, I think, and that raised the questions. Then, is it still the same, institutions or people that rule this country, or because they're the one who really representing the state and the legitimate power to make any official change in the history? So that would be the question then, and for that particular question, I'm doing the research. So is it really transitional justice? Having all these mechanisms in transitional justice really matters in our democracy, or is there really a what is there in our democratization period that change or not changing anything of our acknowledgement of our own history and identities, national identities in this way.
And is there a sense with the massacres because I've read estimates. I mean, I think the CIA estimate was around about 500,000. It couldn't go up to 1 million. There are some that go higher. There are some that go lower. But that accepted idea. Yet it wasn't just the killings. It was the idea of killing the children, the idea of suppressing revenge killings, and then people being imprisoned and being basically legally marked as suspect citizens. Is there an essence that in terms of justice, there's not a large-scale will to right that wrong? Is that connected to the idea that somehow from that perspective, from that new order perspective of those people that you say still might rule, that this was somehow, despite being unpalatable, it was justified in some way to do this?
I'm quite hesitate with the idea that we don't have political will, or the state or the government doesn't have political will, because that often the thing that people always raise, because the government doesn't have political will or whatever. But I found out that a lot of all these politicians and actors, not a lot of, some of them, even in the leadership positions, like Abdurrahman Wahid, for example, did really try to, and have political will to try to address this kind of thing and try to rewrite the new history of Indonesia. But I think it's more, it's beyond the capacity of individual political will, like it's more, we're talking about power in more structured and historical legacies on it. And I think it is obvious that we have more conservative politicians ruling the countries rather than more progressive or more what do you call that, critical leaders ruling the country. And these conservatives in many ways are coming from the backgrounds of institutions or organizations that directly involved in the massacre, in the 65 violence, or benefited from that. Like we have the military, of course, especially the army. I mean, some new studies and evidence shows a structured command for doing that. Like one of a colleague who recently just graduated from Melbourne University, Jess Melvin, found out some of this structured command that directly saying that there is something, structural command that took place from the army, but also organizations like NU, the Nahdlatul Ulama, the biggest Muslim organizations in Indonesia, also in some areas in Java, also directly involved in that. And for example, in one of the cases in Palu, for example, where I also included in my research, the perpetrator are institutionalized, as the army direct the local people to do that, or even in Bali. So it's in a way that there are lots of parts of elements in society that also involved in that directly. And state institutions also involved directly, state bureaucracy also involved directly, but also those who are benefited economically and politically from that massacre, like student organizations, perhaps. I suspect HMI, the Himpunan Muslim Indonesia, the Islamic Muslim Association, Islamic Student Muslim Association. And the Pemuda Pancasila, the Pancasila youth wings from the Golkar. If you see movies, The Look of the Silence or The Act of Killing by Joshua Oppenheimer, it shows, for example, our current vice president giving directions for the vigilance to directly kill or whatever with these communist people. So, and you can imagine we have that person now in charge as vice president. So how can you expect 65 massacres to be
There's an
settled?
interesting moment that now that you mentioned the act of killing, when he was,
he was
on the megaphone doing the thing,
yeah.
and he stops briefly,
Yeah.
obviously considering the appearance of this, or what it would be looked like. And as I recall, he said something to the director along the lines of he wasn't quite sure how if this was a good thing to show, and yet it also showed that the idea of being involved in the massacre, or having some connection to it, or being indifferent to the concept of it, it was a very open thing. It wasn't very hidden. Whereas when I was watching that, I could think to myself, this is not a very good thing for a politician to be engaging in. Yet this is genuinely what he thought.
But those people who are either directly or indirectly involved in that is very confident to say that that's okay, you know, like doing that, you know, it's nothing wrong with that, because we're saving the nation from communism. And like the former minister of coordinating minister for law and security once said, that the general, he said that, well, we had to that massacre took place because it was necessary, because it was okay, because we are saving the nation. So there's nothing wrong with that. So that is the main challenge, I think, in terms of discourse, you know. Like those massive atrocities took place because, and justified because it was an attempt to save the nation from communism. Same thing with killing the civilians in Papua was justified because it is saving the integrity of the national integrity. So and nationalism, because we cannot bear to lose Papua because it's part of Indonesia. It's dogmatic in a way, but it's justifying
this idea that the killing,
same thing,
as
so
nasty, and we don't like it. But
the same
in
logic.
the end, we have to do it.
And lots of Indonesian, I think this is also part of the success legacies of Suharto in indoctrinating the society with their discourse, the state discourse on nationalism, on especially nationalism, saying that this kind of thing, communism, separatism, fundamentalism, is threatening our countries and our nations. So this is what they sell, and most of the society in Indonesia bought that. So using those three, what do you call that, issues, for example, it easily turn a group of minority or individuals vulnerable by the society. Like, for example, the Shia minority, for example, they're being so threatened because they were considered as fundamentalists. You know, they're not Muslim, they're not us. You know, so it's okay to burn their houses. It's okay to what do you call that?
Maybe ethnically cleanse an area or something.
So it's really easy to turn a group or individual into a threat of the nations using at least those three issues.
And it's interesting because it's coming back down to something that's quite topical. We talk about this idea of radicalization, as if there's a small group of people that will be radicalized and they become enormously dangerous. And yet, when I look, for example, Australian colonial history, or Australian nationalism, or Indonesian nationalism, there's a similar thread, this idea of sacrifice, of death, killing the nation, things that are bigger than just ideas of right and wrong. And I look, for example, at this concept of impunity, you mentioned East Timor before, this idea, for example, we have an enormous amount of evidence about command structures. I think there was a book, Masters of Terror, I think Des Ball and a number of others did it, and it was so detailed. We had at one stage Interpol pages wanted and various other things. But of course in East Timor, there seems to have been a push from Guzmao and others. We're a small country. We need to have good relations with Indonesia. We need to have good relations with Australia. So we accept a sense of this injustice in a way. We're unable to bring transitional justice because we don't have the ability to enforce it. And of course, Indonesia or Australia or the United States is not going to do that for one reason or another. I wonder what your thoughts are on this idea of impunity, because there's one argument that says it's too difficult to try people now because so many people are implicated, as you say, like this complicity. And yet on the other hand, there are other instances of massacres and events that we see where we pursue them very strong, and rightfully so, because they've done terrible things on the basis that they've done terrible things. So why is there, you think, in an international sense, maybe a double standard on these particular things, and what does it mean if we have notions like universal human rights, but we can't we can't enforce it, we can't have a truth commission, because there are somehow things that are more important than these particular notions?
I think impunity is just a permanent means for the what you call it, the status quo, the political power and institution to consolidate themselves and change them and transform them into another forms of whatever regime or whatever, because during those periods nobody's really challenging them. But if in a sudden we have some people, not regular people, some mastermind or really those who were designing the perpetrators or whatever, the incidents of violence, for example, were trial, then the moment for this power to consolidate then become disrupted. So and that for me is also another indication that there hasn't really anything changed in Indonesia from the Suharto regime until now, because impunity helps them to reconsolidate in a way. And they are benefiting also from some of the local, traditions or beliefs in society that also try to, believe that, we can't really look on what happens in the past, we should move on, whatever. But it's in a way that's mutually benefit. But so like in Bali, for example, or in some Muslim dominating society, the religious leader would say, in Islam we should just forget the past and try to reconcile ourselves, whatever. But it's just doesn't make sense if we try to reconcile with it if we're not acknowledging that. So impunity is one. But also we had some trials. Basically, it was a hope to challenge impunity. But what happened was the trial only tried the lower ranks of the institutions, like the military, for example, and at the end, eventually, they are being freed. They are being acquitted. So, in a way, so I had a question once. Is it better to have trials and then acquitted all of the suspected, or impunity, total impunity? And I realized now it doesn't make any difference, because it's just like performing. State are trying to performing justice, but it's really not what we want because it doesn't break the impunity. So it's just a tactical concessions, and Indonesian state has been doing that since the earliest of 70s, when the international communities, especially international donors, pushed Suharto to stop the execution of political prisoner of 65, and after the Santa Cruz massacre. So what the Indonesian government did is try to do this tactical concession, try to perform justice, but they're using the back doors to basically give all the space for impunities. So yeah, that's exactly what happened with all this TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Law, with the trials and whatever. And recently, one of the perpetrator, the one that killed Munir, the human rights activist who were poisoned during his flight to Amsterdam.
Yes.
Yeah, he just released. He was punished for 20 years of jail, and he's been doing that for 5 years, and now the state released him. So this is another way of performing justice, just to show that, you know, we do really have willingness to do all this justice, but this is not your kind of justice. This is our kinds of justice. At least we did it, you know, like better than nothing.
This is what we're prepared to do.
Yeah, and this is, I remember, I can't remember now who said that, but there was one from the government, authority from the government that said that, come on, we have this, you know, what else do you want? Well, the society needs justice. What you did is performing justice, but you're not doing justice, you know, because then we don't have political judgment of what is right, what is wrong. What you're doing is not promoting human rights, but promoting human wrongs, basically. So yeah.
Because this is an interesting thing, because it comes back to the core of, say, killing and dying for nationalism. The idea of the greater good, that the myth can be made real. I think of Manifest Destiny in the United States being taught in schools, a completely unscientific, unprovable idea that it was God's will, and that the United States was destined for these particular things. But of course, if that's taught and generations go through this concept of, yes, we are destined, there is a manifest destiny to us, how do you unravel, as you mentioned before, you know, you've had the consolidation under the Suharto era of the textbooks, the history be written. I mean, Kate McGregor's written about the Indonesian army and its relationship with history, and it's taken that relationship very seriously, because it has gone to great lengths to construct that history and then teach the right history to Indonesian children, each generation. And whether it takes or it doesn't take, it still must have an impact on people going through, because to pinprick the myth is a psychological thing. When people are told it's not so, it's hard for them to accept. So how, in a sense, with justice, do we get beyond the myth? Is it a case of the justice has to come by attacking the myths and pulling them apart?
I think education is important, and you mentioned about this textbooks in schools, whatever, because then we can learn about truth. I remember one of the victims that I met on 65, she said one time, truth on 65 is everywhere, but it's nowhere. So in a way that she's saying that so many people have been written so many things about 65, whether it's right or wrong, it's another thing. But there have been so many sources of knowledge about what happened. But why is it no one, what is it? Why is it the new generation didn't learn anything? And looking back at our systems of education, the history course is one of the subjects that has to have textbook, and that textbook is produced by the state. So this is probably different from the Australian system, because my son is also in the primary school, and the school doesn't actually have a specific obligatory book for students to read.
This is what you need to know.
Yeah. You can have your history stories from wherever. And my son was given the chance to write a paper on white settlement, for example, or draw something, or just to explain with his own words about white settlement, for example. But in Indonesia, the school obliges every student to read the book that is written by the state. And if the state still not acknowledging what happened, our history, then how can the students learn? It's not possible for students to read Kate McGregor's book or Robert Cribb's books. It's just not possible for them, and their exams are marked by what they read from those books, the exact words. Like me, for example, I remember the questions in the exams, and we have lots of exams for students. The questions was, when did the war, Diponegoro's war, took place? It was in 1825 until 1830, but in Indonesia we call it 1925 until 1930, and in Indonesia we usually just use the last period, like 25 to 30. So 1825 and 1830. So it was like, if you refer to a time watch, for example, 6:25 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. right?
Yeah.
So we often make jokes during the Maghrib. The Maghrib is Islamic afternoon time,
yep.
And in Indonesia it usually took place in 1825 p.m. to 1830. So we usually answer the questions with during Maghrib. So when the question was, when was the war took place on Diponegoro against the Dutch? During Maghrib, because it was 1825
yes.
until 1830. So that was a joke at that time, but
because it's so prescriptive.
Yeah, but you have to answer the exact thing that was written in your history book. The same thing with the 65 case. It's the exam or the books never tells about what took place after the 30th of September 1965. It only mentioned about the midnight of 30th of September until 1st of October, where Communist Party members killed all the generals or whatever. And that is an attempt for a coup against the state. And that's what the children until today are still learning, but they never know about what happened after that, where, instead of the 7 generals, there are like hundreds of thousands or millions of people were also killed. And that large amount of quantity never been told, never been brought into the textbook.
So in essence, it's like their deaths still don't equal
the
generals.
Yeah. So I think that is also another challenge, because to say that having a state textbook is one particular important thing, but this also involved money, because some people get lots of money by producing the books. So they're giving like a tender or whatever for some parties to produce the books every year. So you can imagine providing those kind of books for all the students around Indonesia, all the population, the major big populations in Southeast Asia, in Asia even, to read the books. It's an advantage. So
someone's making some money.
Yeah, someone's making money for that.
Yes.
But I think I remember just a few months ago, I talked to one of the senior bureaucrats within the Ministry of Education, and she actually told me good news, because the new curriculum for educations for primary and high school, one of it, I think one of the innovation is saying that history subject should not only from the textbook. So this is the first time the government actually allows students to learn history from other sources, which is good. I think this is the only good thing from our recent curriculum that was passed last year. And now the new minister is trying to review this curriculum, and I wanted to suggest to him not to change that particular one on the history subject, because that's another opportunity for us to right the wrongs of our history.
So in a way, one of the almost the restorative justice aspect of this is correcting the historical and political record through things like education and looking at this textbook. I mean, it's not inconceivable that an alternative textbook could be proposed at some stage. I wonder if I come back to some of the other efforts of transitional justice, and you mentioned earlier the tribunal concept that you were working, and I wondered if you could expand a little bit about this tribunal and some of the ideas, because it strikes me that tribunal is attempting to correct the historical record by highlighting the information that we have, and I wonder what your thoughts are on what you think this could achieve, not just in Indonesia, but maybe internationally as well.
Because we've tried basically everything, every opportunities, every space that we thought we could do something on that, at domestic levels, but also at local levels. But basically, we've tried from memorialization efforts, we've tried from the trials effort. The National Commission on Human Rights did an investigation on 65, but the Attorney General Office and the central government didn't want to follow it up.
Did they refuse to accept it, or was there something along those lines?
They said that it's the evidence are weak, and that they returned it to the National Commission on Human Rights to whatever, revise or improve it or whatever, and then they return it back to the Attorney General's office, and until now it's just frozen, basically. It's sitting there, and so the Law and Truth and Reconciliation Commission failed, whatever. So everything's failed. So some of us, Indonesians, thought maybe we should try another window, another door that is not from the domestic, but something that took place in international settings. It was quite successful when some Indonesians are pushed for state's accountability on the political prisoners in the 70s or whatever. Maybe we can have something at the international settings to try to address this. So, and we learned that huge, massive success from the act of killings, because that film basically really getting high international attentions on that particular event on 65, but we need something more comprehensive, because that films only depict particular event at particular sites in North Sumatra. So some of us thought, okay, maybe we should do a tribunal. We acknowledge that it's almost impossible to do it through the UN system. So we were thinking of a People's Tribunal, the one that similar to the one that in the past we had on on the comfort women, or on the permanent people's tribunal in some of the cases in the past or ongoing. So so basically looking at more legal aspects of what happened, trying to prove some evidence that these things occurred as systematically, and that state is responsible for that, not only military but state as a representative. We realize that it's not possible to make a specific indictment against specific person, naming or shaming a particular names. But what our aim is to get the state to, as a party, that the one that the ultimate representative of the systematic violence, to be accountable for whatever happened. And secondly, to get other complicit states to also held responsible, because somehow I think you also did some research on that. The US, the British, and maybe Australia also complicit or somehow involved in that, also to acknowledge and responsible for that. And third, we also would like to attempt to make a international history for people to acknowledge that this is one of the biggest genocide or crimes that took place in human in world history, basically. And because we really don't have that kind of acknowledgement. And of course, the fourth one is trying to get the Indonesian society to really think again, or and get a new sense of truth, the other sides of truth that they have never been told about, with this kind of thing took place at international levels. And of course, most of all, we try to get another sense of justice for the victims, because, well, almost all, if I can say, all the victims that I met and I tried to discuss with them this tribunals issue, they were very enthusiastic in a way that they're really, it's not that they want individual reparations for them, but the collective reparations at the collective and national reparations took place, and this is also another sense of justice that they have been long for. So
that acknowledgement through correcting and that their stories can be part
because
of the record.
all of the four aims is basically what they want, the local, national, but international acknowledgement of whatever happened. The narratives of sufferings are being told at the international settings, and that's also another justice for them. So yeah, that's basically what the background of this.
And if maybe I can conclude with this, with the tribunal, when it's completed, do you see that there could be a role in the information that's contained within the tribunal, even in maybe teaching a history course or an educational sense, or an archive, just some kind of national record, that even if there are no trials, we can't try this general, we can't try this person, that the historical record is corrected so that people are aware of the fact that, yes, this general did this, this person did do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's our post-tribunal aimed. So after the tribunal took place, we are aiming to publish, for example, now me and Saskia and some other people are coordinating to compile the background reports that we'll use for indictments, collecting some of the cases and evidence and stories that could support the indictment that will be used in tribunal. We're thinking to later on, after the tribunal, publish this background report, and that could be another source of knowledge for wider audience, including in Indonesia, about the history, whatever took place after the 30th September 1965. And another effort that we're thinking now is to collect all this evidence and informations as a database project. It's like a memorialization
Yes.
center for the 65. That's also one of the thing that we're trying to build after the tribunal. But now we're still concentrating on next year's tribunal, which would take place on the November 27, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, after that, we should think that this is not one-time event. It should have to follow up with more sustainable thing that can be used for Indonesians in particular, but also for history, international history.
And the idea that this forms a like a collective archive of material
exactly.
that can be preserved and kept safe, because I think of a recent example in the fighting. It might have been in Syria, where a particular Armenian church was destroyed. It contained ancient or had ancient records, I believe, but it also had a number of records from the Armenian genocide in there, lost. And of course, this idea of preserving knowledge, but in this case, preserving knowledge that has been ignored and not valued, and then changing attitudes toward that in the future.
There have been some initiatives from the local NGOs to do that, and some of them also collected like hundreds and thousands of testimonies or some kind of evidence, hard evidence, whatever they can get. But the problem is maybe how to manage these archives and this evidence, but secondly, how to make this accessible for everyone needs to do more research or even to thought about histories. So these two issues we're hoping to, like we can come together after the tribunal and let's just, try to figure out something more sustainable, more accessible for everyone and more manageable in a way, so that we really have something that we can keep for years and years to come.
Hopefully for centuries.
Yeah, for centuries.
Well, thank you very much, Alia, for speaking with me.
Thank you
It's been
for
very
having
interesting.
me.
Thank you.
Thank you.